Hello everybody, Blue Dooley, and in this part 2 of the Ultimate Transmission Swap, we're going to go over the actual brackets that adapt the Allison to the Cummins engine, and then the transfer case that was in the Dodge to the Allison transmission. We did get the engine and the transmission in the truck. Unfortunately, we had some problems getting the transfer case hooked to the transmission, tore the gasket, so I had to wait for a new gasket. So we'll get that video in part 3. So this will be a 3-part video series of doing a transmission swap. So stay tuned and we'll get to it. I'm not sure how good you're going to be able to disable in here, but the shiny bits had to get clearanced so the starter will fit up in here nice and tightly. And then these two tabs also had to be clearanced so this adapter plate would fit in. Because as you can see, where the starter goes adds a little bit more to the material. So you have to clearance those out, but you don't want to get too close into the block or you'll get into where the threads are and you won't have a complete thread for these bolts that hold this together to the engine to bite into. So it's definitely take your time and remove absolutely the most minimal amount you can remove to do this. If the engine's still in the truck, it might be a little bit trickier to do this than with the engine out. Again, I'm a pretty big dude and trying to get wedged up in there with a grinder or a die grinder to get this stuff taken care of. I'm kind of glad I'm doing it with the engine out of the truck. CA Conversions sent me a starter. It's an XDP HD starter. This is for a 6.0 power stroke, because of course the adapter, you can't even use the Cummins starter anymore or the Dodge starter anymore. But the kit came with the starter, it came with this aluminum bracket or a mounting plate. All the hardware is included. I didn't get the torque converter filmed because when I was putting this together, getting the torque converter in, one, a triple disc torque converter isn't light, and two, the input shaft is stepped, so getting all the splines lined up so it'll drop all the way in, kind of a pain in the ass. I actually had to stand the transmission up on end and then set the torque converter straight down on it to get it to seat finally. The torque converter has no welds for nuts that bolt to the flex plate. They're actually machined feet on the back of the torque converter that are about yay long and then tapped for the bolts that go from the flex plate into the torque converter. Really nicely done. The torque converter came from CA Conversions. The starter, all the adapters and everything came with it. So it's a pretty complete kit that they put together for you. Again, the only thing that really doesn't make it direct bolt on is having to cut these two tabs. Then we got some transmission cooler plumbing to do. It's these two holes right here. The dipstick goes right here. And I gotta wait for James to get here because I'll need his help to bar over the engine after I get this first torque converter bolt in. So he can bar the engine over and I can get the next torque converter bolts in. And then somewhere there's probably a plug for this. And that will be time to put the engine into the truck. Now that I got 2 in, I'll just go ahead and do the rest. There are 6 in total, and you want to hand tighten them all and then back them off just to like turn. You don't want to over torque them too fast or you might tweak that torque converter and pilot bushing and kind of get a misalignment going. And we definitely don't want any misalignment. You're at a little bit of an angle, I know. And after you get these all installed, they simply torque to 45 foot-pounds. And it does say to use red Loctite, not blue Loctite. I'm probably putting on a little too much. I said this probably would be easier. This is another one of those things where it's probably easier out of the truck than it would be in the truck. I suppose you could take the turbo off of it and lean over the fender and try to look at it upside down, but there's that one. I just have a 1/2-inch breaker bar on a 15mm socket on the bolts for the harmonic balancer. That's how I'm barring the engine over. And it actually is working pretty smooth. Not too terrible at all. Probably get my head in the way. At least you're not looking at black on black on black. So I haven't hit this side with paint yet. There's a couple. I dropped one, so I need to search around the garage for a minute and find that one. But it's pretty straightforward. Get them all finger tight, and then go ahead and tighten them all down to 45 foot-pounds, and your torque converter is installed. But you do need red Loctite. Blue won't work. That's a whole lot of black, but I hit that aluminum mounting adapter with paint on this side. I'll get the starter in and then hit the other side with some paint, just so it kind of all looks nice. And you won't even be able to tell if you don't know that that's not a factory Cummins option. Okay, as I mentioned, I've had problems with this truck kind of eating starters, so I ground off a little bit of XDP's finish here on the starter. I'm going to use a ground strap, bolt it right there so it gets a good contact with the starter case, and then we'll, like I said, run it up to the block or someplace to get a really good ground, and then hopefully this starter will last a lot longer than the mother starters. The problem with the starters on the Cummins is they're not made by Cummins, they're made by Dodge, so they're kind of crap. This ground wire runs back and grounds to the starter case, and then grounds on the same bolt as the actual battery. It grounds as the same negative post on the passenger side battery and the same bolt. So that should give that starter a really good ground, as it's kind of important on electronics, especially motors and stuff, to have a good ground so so they last a long time. We need to get the oil. So this is the second little the first modification I've had to make. As you can see, I trimmed this stud down from here because it fits in this adapter. And with it long, unless you have a tubing wrench or cut a notch in a box end, you can't actually get a wrench in here. Here, let's switch sides maybe. You can't actually get a wrench in here to get on the nut at all if you don't trim that down. I don't even think a crow's foot would fit. I think you need like a hydraulic line wrench, which is basically a box end wrench that has a notch in it to go over the steel part of the hydraulic line to get onto fittings when you can't get another wrench in there. So I trimmed this with the grinder just to make it so I can actually get in there and torque this down, because this is actually the adapter and the transmission mount. So the directions don't say anything about that, but again, if you don't have a line wrench or a special box end that gets on can go over the stud and then get on the nut, I'm not sure how you're supposed to get those tight. All right. Yeah, if this was an open box end, you could just flip it over here. And you're not gonna have a lot of room, but if you had a line wrench, like I said, you wouldn't need to trim these. So far, this has kind of been one of the most pain in the ass things, just because you have big fingers, so it's hard to get them started anyways. So that's the transmission mount. We'll get that on the transmission here in a little while, and hopefully we'll get this stuff put together. The power steering pump is a little bit of a pain because it's got just a slot to line up with the vacuum pump for the coupling. And it took me a little bit to get the engine turned over so that lined up. Probably would have saved some time if I'd left that together and disconnected the hydraulic lines, but I didn't want to drain the entire power steering system and the brakes when I could just unbolt it and leave it in the truck. So that may or may not save you time in the future if you want to do it. Leave it on and disconnect the hoses, or take it off like I did. But I got it finally back on, so we'll tighten that down. Got the transfer case sitting in a bucket so the ATF will finish draining out of it. And we just pushed in a new seal to the input shaft. And interestingly enough, this snap ring and entire surface was covered in silicone sealant. There isn't actually a gasket or anything here, just a whole thin smear of basically RTV holding this in. So I need to clean up this backside, and this notch here actually needs to align with a 5th hole right here. It looks like the holes are drilled symmetrically, but they're not. You can only put this on one way. So that way you always get it in the right position. You don't have to worry about clogging it. If one hole doesn't line out, just turn it until all the holes line up. That's where it needs to be, because it only fits one way. There's a tone ring we need to get on this shaft, and it is currently in the oven. I got the oven cranked up to 500 degrees. So that'll slip over here, and then we'll dump some water on it so it doesn't mess up the seal with heat transfer. And then we'll get the adapter and all the gaskets and stuff bolted to the transfer case next. I got the tone ring on. The directions want it closer to the seal, but even though I heated it up well into 500 degrees, I only got it on so far, and I don't want to hammer on it anymore because I don't want to tear something up in the transfer case. But this sits flush enough that it should pick the tone ring up, I hope. Like I said, I don't want to hit on it any harder because I don't want to damage anything in the transfer case, but that ring just cooled off so fast, or
It didn't expand as much as they thought maybe it was going to, but that's as far as I got it on there. So I think we're gonna just have to run with that and hope for the best.
All right, so now we got to get the transfer case adapter on, now that we got that tone ring on. And bolts are pretty well labeled. But from the looks of the directions, these black ones here, and there's 2 bags of them, but they actually bolt the adapter plate here to the transfer case. Like I said, they have pretty good directions, and you can see in both of those that the tone ring needs to be a little further in, but I just don't want to hammer on it anymore. And much like this, wind's picking up. Much like this seal here and retainer, the holes only line up one way. So we'll spin it around. There you go. That's all of those holes lined up. So now we just got to get the adapter on here to do the same thing. Maybe we can stick it to something. I think that's going to be too transparent. I don't have it. Well, I'll put you right there. Just try you like that. Oh, I guess we'll pick it up and see. Maybe we'll put this on here. Let's see where stuff lines up. All right, just like that. So the tone ring is actually almost even with the 4-wheel drive shifter. That does have all of those bolts lined up. You probably can't see still. I apologize, I don't have a lot of stuff to magnetize you to. It doesn't say to use any thread locker on any of these. There must be Ford bolts and Dodge bolts. So let's try this other bag. See if these are a little different pitch. Yes, there are 2 different pitch bolts. Actually, there is just a tiny bit of size difference between them. So that's what it looks like on the transfer case, and then D for Dodge and F for Ford, I guess is how you clock it on that adapter plate. So we'll get that adapter plate bolted to this, and then we'll save putting the transfer case and the transmission together after the engine and transmission are in the truck. So let me get these cinched down, and I believe, let's see here, look at the directions. Doesn't actually have a torque spec on the directions, so you must just torque them down to yeah, I would imagine you torque these down to whatever the Dodge torque specs are, which I think were 25 foot-pounds. I will have to tighten these down. You will need a 5/16 Allen. And then the torque rating on these, from according to what I registered on the book, since these are kind of a bigger bolt than the studs that initially were in here, these are 30 to 35 foot-pounds of torque. So I'll snug these down with a ratchet, and then we'll get the really old torque wrench out and torque them down. There we go. So you got a gasket here, and a gasket between these two machine surfaces. All except one right here of these actually bolt through the transmission. So just this one little guy is covered up by the kind of weird shape on the back of the transmission. So it's got a nice countersunk Allen head. So this is actually going to wait to go onto the transmission, as I mentioned, after the transmission's in the truck. Because between this spacer and how much longer the transmission is, overall length, this would just be too much weight hanging off of that engine stand. So we'll put this on after it's in the truck. It looks like it's actually going to be pretty easy to reach even these top bolts and get them put into place. Except unfortunately I was a dumbass and left the transfer case out in the sun, so it's probably hotter than hell.